All right, so I'm going to go through a series of 5 people that are frequently put together on the AP exam, or like their groups of people are put together on the AP exam. So if you know one, they're probably going to get a question, or if you see one, you're probably going to get a question about another. So let's start in time period 1. This is the very late 1500s into the very early 1600s. Solplavita and Bartolomeo de las Casas. So put them around like late 1500s, early 1600s. They're both Spanish. And Solplavita argued that indigenous people, that Native Americans, were natural slaves because they were inferior in intellect, and Spanish conquest and the encomienda system and forced conversions were justified. It was a moral obligation of the Spanish to Christianize and civilize them. And so he was in favor of praying towns, forced conversions, violence, enslaving natives in the silver and gold mines, the encomienda system. Whereas de las Casas, he actually was an encomienda holder, and he turned into a missionary and advocated instead for natives and humane treatment of natives. He said that they were human, that they were intelligent, just different. They shouldn't be enslaved, and that the Spanish, his own people, were treating them morally wrong. And so this goes along with our time period 1 stuff, where the Spanish were extremely brutal. I mean, we have Hernan Cortez, we have like the conquering of the Incas and the Aztecs, and the brutal treatment of Native Americans, and then the disease that fell upon them that killed off over 80% of them. And so these 2 men kind of showed differing perspectives on the first early colonizers, the Spanish. Moving into time period 3, put this around like Declaration of Independence time, like think like 1770s, 1780s, 1790s. Alexander Hamilton versus Thomas Jefferson. There are 2 prominent figures because they had different visions for like the future. Hamilton was Secretary of the Treasury. Jefferson was also in Washington's cabinet. He was Secretary of State. Hamilton wanted a strong central government. He was a federalist. He wanted a big economy based on industry. He wanted the government to have lots of power in the economy. He wanted his financial plan, which was all about assuming state debts and oh gosh, I'm going blank. Having a national bank and tariffs to try and fund government programs. He was big on like establishing the nation's credit and just trying to build up a secure financial future for the government. Whereas Jefferson kind of feared that like power of the government over the economy, because in his opinion, that's what they experienced under Britain. He was the leader of the Democratic Republican Party. Once we get like more the first party system, he emphasized states' rights, a farm, agrarian, egalitarian economy. He was very wary of like central power, federalism. Hamilton was a loose interpreter of the Constitution, the necessary and proper clause, the elastic clause. Jefferson was a strict interpreter of the Constitution, and he generally just opposed everything about Hamilton's plan, specifically the national bank. And so the reason we look at them as opposites is it's their fault as to why we have a 2-party system. The formation of the first political parties in the United States formed around these 2 dudes. All right, moving on to time period 5. Put this in like the late 1850s, early 1860s. 1858 is actually when they run against each other for the Illinois Senate seat. So Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas debate the issue of slavery in what we call the Lincoln-Douglas debates, or the Freeport Doctrine debates. So basically, they show, if we like put a magnifying glass on them, we can see the views of slavery at the time, essentially. Lincoln is a member of the newly formed Republican Party, brand new, like he's the first. He was a free soiler. He opposed the expansion of slavery into new territories. That's what free soil means. Believing that slavery is morally wrong, but like we can't abolish it because that would rip the nation in half. It's incompatible with our nation's democratic ideas. Like hopefully it just dies out soon. He argued that eventually the Union should be free of slavery, but for right now, let's just stop it where it is and not let it grow. So he was not really an abolitionist. And like we view him as that abolitionist president because he wrote the Emancipation Proclamation. He was in favor of the 13th Amendment. He would have carried it out had he not been assassinated. But honestly, he wasn't an abolitionist until about halfway through the Civil War. Now, Douglas, this is pre-Civil War, by the way. This is 1858. Douglas is a Democrat, and he supports the idea of popular sovereignty, which basically is like new territories should decide for themselves whether or not to permit slavery. Douglas had been a major proponent of the Kansas-Nebraska Act that like caused a bleeding Kansas, all that stuff. So both men like want to keep the Union together, but they both see the writing on the wall of slavery is going to split everything up. And so putting a magnifying glass on them kind of shows us the two major political parties of the day. All right, moving forward, let's go into time period. It says time period 6 on here. I would put it more in time period 7. I'd put it in like the very late 1890s. We have two progressives, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois. They're African-American figures who have really differing views on how to address the race issue in America. And the progressive movement did basically nothing for people of color, besides like in general helping people who are impoverished, and lots of people of color were impoverished. But if we were to point to the progressive movement and say like what progress was there for African Americans, it would be the prominence that these two men have and the like hubbub that they kind of like stirred up to try and get some sort of civil rights thing rocking and rolling. So Booker T. Washington believed that the best way for African Americans to improve their status was through vocational training and working in industry. So in his idea, if blacks focus on being self-sufficient, being economically independent, then they could earn the respect slowly of whites. So in his mind, he's thinking like we will accommodate segregation for now, but kind of like prove ourselves and gradually we'll be equal. In contrast to that, W.E.B. Du Bois was like immediate political, social, and economic equality. Absolutely not waiting for anything. Both of them support higher education. Both of them support economic independence and education of blacks, but just a different way to go about ending segregation and racial discrimination. Du Bois helped find the NAACP in 1909 and basically putting like the spotlight on these two, we see different strategies for achieving racial equality, but it's not really going to happen in their time period. They won't see the gains from the Tuskegee Institute was Booker T. Washington. The Souls of Black Folk was W.E. Du Bois' book. Those things became very popular and very important to the civil rights movement later on after them, as is the NAACP. Super important to the civil rights movement of the like 1950s and 60s. Okay, last one. Speaking of that civil rights movement, we read these speeches in class. The two like major speeches from Martin Luther King Jr., the I Have a Dream speech, the letter from Birmingham jail, you've probably read. You definitely did an AP Gov, and then Malcolm X's most famous speech, the ballot or the bullet. So, two influential figures in the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, both assassinated. They differ in their approaches. Kind of like Booker T. Washington and W.E. Du Bois, but they are civil rights activists in a time when stuff was actually happening. They were actually seeing the gains. So King is a preacher, leader of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and a proponent of nonviolent civil disobedience, as you've seen in Letter from a Birmingham Jail. He believed that racial integration should be achieved through peaceful protests, marches, rallies, economic boycotts, and legal challenges, so the court system as well. And he was inspired by Gandhi, by his Christian faith, by the Baptist Convention, basically. It was arrested multiple times and was assassinated by a white man in Memphis, Tennessee in 1968. Malcolm X was actually a leader of the Nation of Islam, and his like rise to prominence was all about advocating Black self-defense and self-determination. So almost like chosen segregation. We don't need whites to find self-worth was kind of his idea, embracing like a more militant stance in like racial justice. So at first he actually like rejected integration. Basically like we can be self-determined and self-reliant, thinking that African Americans should separate and form their own institutions, their own schools, and take care of their own community. He does go on a Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, and his views change a little bit then, and he becomes a little bit more about integration and unity, and he will also be assassinated by someone who doesn't agree with his more militant stance.